I had never thought a single sentence could stop me in my tracks. But there she was, leaning slightly against the edge of the classroom desk, hair tucked just so behind her ear, and she said it. "Stay after class. We need to talk." The room hummed with the dull scrape of chairs and the distant clatter of lockers, yet somehow, around her, the world felt muffled, like the air itself had thickened with expectation. I hesitated near the door, pretending to organize my notes, but I could feel her eyes on me. She had always had that way, making you hyper-aware of yourself, your breath, the way your fingers brushed the pages. Her name is Caroline. She's in her mid-40s, graceful without effort, and carries an air of quiet authority that's softened, somehow, by something more intimate, more fragile if you look close. And well, I'm 22, still fumbling through the edges of adulthood, yet here I am, drawn inexplicably into the orbit of someone who had once taught me equations and grammar but now feels like she's teaching me something far more dangerous. She steps closer, just a little, her shoulder brushing mine as she adjusts the stack of papers on the desk. My pulse flares. That brief contact sends a shiver up my spine, and I catch a hint of her perfume, soft, almost lilac, lingering like it's deliberately staying with me. I try to focus on her words, but the sound of her voice, low, slightly husky, measured, fills the space between us, settling over me like warm sunlight. "I wanted to talk about your project," she says, but her eyes linger too long, and I know it isn't just about the project. She bites her lip subtly, a micro-movement that doesn't escape me. My throat tightens, and I feel foolish for noticing, for feeling every fraction of a second as if it carries weight beyond reason. I nod, murmuring something inarticulate, trying not to let my gaze drop too quickly, trying not to betray the way my stomach knots when she moves even the slightest. Her hand brushes against mine, an accident, she claims, but the contact sparks something, a small current that seems to hum straight through my chest. I can't look away. Her presence fills the room. Its warmth, its quiet authority, its danger wrapped in silk. She shifts, leaning against the desk, and I take a tentative step closer, as if drawn by gravity. There's a subtle catch in her breath, almost imperceptible, but I notice. Her eyes flick toward mine, and for a moment, the air thickens, heavy with everything unspoken, the years since I last saw her, the unacknowledged pull between us, the things I've imagined but never dared to name. I clear my throat, trying to break the tension, but it doesn't work. And then she tilts her head slightly, just enough to catch the light, and I feel like I'm seeing her for the first time, not the teacher who handed out homework, not the woman behind the lectern, but Caroline, the woman who could unsettle me with a glance and make the world feel impossibly small. Before either of us can say more, the door creaks open, startlingly loud, and someone's voice calls from the hallway. Caroline flinches almost imperceptibly. I step back, my chest tightening, caught between the magnetic pull of the moment and the intrusion of reality. She glances at me, eyes dark, almost staring, and whispers, "Don't go." And then the world outside the classroom door exists again. But only barely. I stay behind, shoving the door closed just enough to muffle the hallway chatter. The room smelled faintly of chalk dust and her perfume, lavender and something warmer, wood smoke-like. My fingers trembled slightly as I stacked my notes on the desk, aware that every movement might betray how long I'd been holding on to a memory of her, of us, long before this moment. Caroline leaned back against the desk, arms crossed, but there was a softness in her posture, the kind that only appears when someone allows themselves to be seen, even a little. "I didn't expect you to stay," she said, but her voice was quiet, threaded with something I couldn't name. Nostalgia? Regret? Both, maybe. We were complicated before this even started. I remembered sitting in her classroom years ago, scribbling notes, while she moved through the rows, graceful and composed, yet somehow vulnerable if you noticed the subtle pauses, the way her gaze softened over certain students. I had admired her then, maybe more than I should have, but I was a different person, timid, unsure. And she had been untouchable. Now, though, the distance is gone. But the risk remains. I'm 22. She's 45. A teacher once, now someone I barely know outside the edges of professional pretense. Anyone who saw us together would ask questions we're not ready to answer. That knowledge pulses between us like a silent drum, keeping every movement careful, every word weighed. She shifts, and the desk creaks under the subtle pressure. Her shoulder brushes mine again, this time longer. My stomach tightens. I want to step back, but I don't. I want to let it linger. The air between us tastes like unspoken confession, charged with the things we're daring ourselves not to say. I thought about your project, she says, but it's hollow, almost a pretext. Her hand brushes the edge of mine as she reaches for a pen, just enough to send a spark through my chest. I catch the way her fingers linger near mine, a momentary hesitation that feels deliberate, and I swallow hard. You always notice everything, she murmurs, half in accusation, half in wonder. The words hang, and I feel my pulse rise. It's not just the physical closeness, it's the way she studies me, really studies me, as if trying to read the 22-year-old man I've become, the one who's secretly still the student she once knew. There's a silence, stretched thin, intimate. My hand itches to reach out, but I freeze, caught between wanting to cross the line and needing to respect the invisible boundary that still exists. Then, almost without thinking, she lets her fingers brush the back of my hand, a fleeting contact, electric and impossible to ignore. Her gaze meets mine, steady, and for a heartbeat, we simply exist in that charged space between desire and restraint. My chest tightens. Her lips twitch, maybe a smile, maybe a confession. Neither of us says anything, but we don't have to. That brush of skin, that shared pause, carries everything. And in that silence, I realize we're already caught. I barely had time to think before the sharp click of the classroom door startled me. My chest jolted. Caroline's head turned slightly, eyes widening just enough, and I froze. A voice called from the hallway, muffled but insistent. Caroline? You still here? Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she exhaled slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. My pulse hammered. We weren't ready, not for interruptions, not for anyone seeing how close we were, not for the weight of everything we couldn't say aloud. I stepped back instinctively, but she didn't pull entirely away. Instead, her shoulder nudged mine, the contact brief but enough to send heat skittering across my skin. My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, to explain, to claim something I wasn't sure I had the right to, but I didn't. It's probably nothing, she murmured, but her voice quivered just slightly, betraying her own hesitation. I noticed the small tremor in her fingers as she picked up a paper, folding it unnecessarily, almost to steady herself. Every motion was intimate in its restraint. We lingered in silence, each heartbeat loud in the quiet classroom. I wanted to lean in, to close the distance, to brush a hand against hers, not recklessly, but in a way that said everything my words could never manage. I could see the tension in her jaw, the slight parting of her lips, the way her gaze flicked to mine and held just long enough to ignite something I had no business feeling. A message beeped from my phone, breaking the spell. I cursed under my breath and checked it, a reminder of a meeting I couldn't miss. My fingers hovered over the screen, half wanting to delete it, half wanting to pretend it didn't exist. Caroline's eyes followed my hand, and I caught that flicker again, the one that said she understood how impossible this was, how thrilling and forbidden. We moved closer, almost simultaneously, like gravity had taken over. Her hand brushed my wrist. Mine hovered near hers, unsure whether to retreat or risk crossing the invisible line. I could feel her warmth, smell the faint traces of her perfume mingling with the classroom's faint dustiness. The tension tightened like a coil. Neither of us spoke. Words would ruin it anyway. Instead, we let the silence stretch, charged and almost unbearable. I wanted to touch her face, to trace a line I'd memorized in memory alone, but the fear of what it meant, of who might see, of everything outside these walls, held me back. And yet, we didn't pull apart. Not fully. Instead, she leaned a fraction closer, and I felt the weight of it, the unspoken promise, the shared desire, the tether that refused to break despite all reason. We were closer than we'd ever been, and yet, the room still demanded restraint. Her breath brushed my ear, soft, almost imperceptible. My own caught in response. I could smell her, feel her, and the world outside the classroom, the rules, the age difference, the consequences, faded to a dull echo. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "You're impossible to resist." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We were both suspended on the edge, closer than ever, and neither of us knew which way we would fall first. The classroom was quiet now, empty desks, soft afternoon light slanting through the blinds. But it felt like the world had contracted, leaving only the two of us suspended in a taut, electric bubble. I could hear my own heartbeat in the hollow of the room, but it wasn't mine alone. Caroline's chest rose and fell with a rhythm that drew me in, her presence a gravity I couldn't resist. She stepped closer, deliberately, and I could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted to mine and lingered, heavy with unspoken thoughts. My fingers itched to reach for her, but I stopped short, aware of the line between desire and consequence. And yet, every second we spent in this proximity made that boundary blur. You shouldn't be here," I whispered, though my voice betrayed me with its tremor. Her hand rose almost instinctively, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. Her fingers lingered, grazing my cheek in a feather-light contact that left my skin humming. I swallowed hard, trying to anchor myself, but it was impossible. Every movement she made, every infinitesimal gesture, tugged at something I'd tried to keep hidden for years. "I know," she said softly, and there was something in the catch of her voice, fear, longing, restraint, that made my knees feel suddenly unsteady. She leaned in, almost imperceptibly, close enough that I could smell the warmth of her skin, the faint trace of perfume that had haunted my memory for years. "You have no idea," I started, then faltered because words could never fully capture what I felt. Desire, regret, fear, hope, they all tangled together, impossible to separate. My hand hovered near her arm, close enough to brush if I dared, and I felt her shiver just slightly at the nearness. Her eyes closed for a fraction of a second, and in that brief lapse, I imagined pressing closer, bridging the tiny distance that remained between us. My lips itched to meet hers, to finally give voice to the tension we'd been dancing around for months. And I knew she felt it too. Every subtle tremor, every deliberate pause, every lingering glance betrayed the control we'd been pretending to maintain. "I can't," she whispered, barely audible, and the words were both a confession and a warning. She leaned closer still, her breath brushing my ear, and I felt the electric charge of proximity, impossible, reckless, magnetic. I wanted to respond, to close the gap, to abandon caution entirely. But the universe seemed to hold its breath with us. Outside, a locker slammed in the hallway, a sharp intrusion, a reminder that reality still existed. My chest tightened. Yet we didn't move apart. Our bodies were almost touching, her hand almost in mine, my lips almost against hers. The air between us trembled with everything left unsaid, every restraint stretched thin. And then she looked at me, directly, with a steadiness that was frightening and thrilling all at once, and whispered a single word that made the world tilt. "Now." I was about to close the small gap between us when the soft ping of a phone broke the spell. Caroline stiffened, and I noticed her hand tremble slightly as she reached for the device on her desk. The screen lit up with a message, brief and insistent, but I saw it before she could hide it. It wasn't meant for me. The words burned across the screen. "I saw you today. Who is he?" Her eyes flicked to mine, wide, almost guilty, and I felt my stomach knot. Someone had seen us, or thought they had. Her chest rose and fell faster, and I could feel the subtle tension in her back as she leaned against the desk, just enough to press into me without realizing it. My own pulse raced. Every nerve in my body hummed with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "You," I started, voice low, almost rough. "You didn't tell me someone knew." She shook her head slightly, biting her lip, her hand brushing mine as she tried to reach for the phone. The contact was electric, fleeting, but enough to make my chest tighten. "I didn't want I didn't think it mattered until now, she murmured, voice trembling. Her vulnerability was raw, human, irresistible. I wanted to pull her close, to soothe the sudden fear, but the thought of exposure made the pull of desire all the more urgent, dangerous. I could feel the heat radiating from her, as she shifted slightly closer, her shoulder brushing mine again, and I swallowed hard, aware that this moment could tip into everything we'd been holding back. I can't stop thinking about you, I admitted, almost a whisper, my fingers twitching near hers. The words felt reckless, and I saw the same mixture of desire and hesitation flicker across her face. She inhaled sharply, eyes flicking down at my hand, then back to my eyes, and I realized she was standing on the edge of the same precipice. The room seemed smaller suddenly, charged with the invisible weight of revelation. Every heartbeat was amplified. Every breath, every micro-movement mattered. She leaned in, unintentionally grazing her arm against mine, and I felt the shiver that went straight through me. The line between what was safe and what was inevitable blurred with every passing second. I shouldn't have let it get this far, she said, almost to herself, lips parted, and I caught the subtle rise and fall of her chest. The tension wrapped around us like a living thing, tightening and loosening unpredictably. I could see it in her eyes, fear, longing, the thrill of risk. I could feel it in my own chest, the pull toward her, reckless and undeniable. The world outside had intruded, but somehow, it had made everything closer, sharper, more urgent. And then she made a small, deliberate step toward me, closing the tiny distance between our bodies. Her hand hovered, almost touching mine, and she whispered, low and dangerous, "Are you willing to risk it?" It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. And I knew, in that suspended second, that whatever came next, we couldn't turn back. The classroom felt impossibly small, the late afternoon sun painting stripes of gold across the floor, the air thick with heat and hesitation. Caroline stood just a breath away from me, her hand hovering near mine, either of us daring to close the gap fully. My heart hammered as if it could push me forward, or betray me entirely. "I shouldn't," she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. Her eyes searched mine, fierce and vulnerable at once, like she was looking for permission, for courage she hadn't yet claimed. My fingers twitched, aching to reach for her, to bridge the space that separated what we'd imagined from what we could have. "You don't have to fight it," I said softly, voice low, almost trembling. I could see her inhale sharply, the faint scent of her perfume washing over me, warm and intoxicating. The simple nearness of her, leaning just slightly toward me, made the world shrink to nothing but this suspended moment, fragile and irreversible. She closed the distance just a fraction, and I felt her shoulder brush mine, accidental or deliberate, I didn't care. Her eyes fluttered shut for a heartbeat, and I could see every restraint she'd clung to unraveling. I stepped closer too, just enough that our breaths mingled, the rhythm between us sinking in a quiet, terrifying way. "I've thought about you," I admitted, letting the words escape despite the warning in my mind. "Every day. Since years ago." The truth spilled out in a rush, messy and imperfect. Her lips parted slightly, the tiniest exhale of surprise, disbelief, relief. It was confessional, intimate, the kind of truth that leaves you naked without needing to undress. Her hand brushed mine finally, tentative, electric, and I took it, feeling the warmth of her skin, the tremor beneath. The simple contact was a promise, an acknowledgement that we were both on the edge of the same cliff. "I never stopped thinking about you either," she whispered back, voice low, steady, raw. Her other hand brushed a loose strand of hair from my forehead, and I shivered, aware of every inch of proximity, of the slow, deliberate tension that had built between us for months. We paused, breaths caught, suspended between desire and fear, the world outside forgotten. The classroom was silent, save for the sound of our hearts in our chests. We didn't speak, didn't need to. Every micro-movement, her fingers tracing mine, my shoulder pressing closer, the way our gazes held without blinking, was confession enough. And then I closed the last fraction of distance, not recklessly, but intentionally, letting my forehead rest against hers. Her breath hitched, and I felt her lean into me, just enough to make the choice unmistakable. We were surrendering, together, to what we'd denied for so long. No words were necessary after that. The tension dissolved into something honest, messy, human, an understanding that had been impossible to articulate until this moment. I could feel her pulse against mine, and I knew we both understood everything now, the risks, the desire, the impossibility, and the inevitability. We were finally, undeniably ours. The late afternoon light had softened into golden amber, spilling across the classroom in stripes that felt almost cinematic. The world outside existed, but inside, it was just the two of us, finally unguarded, finally present. Caroline sat in one of the chairs, and I lowered myself beside her, close enough that our shoulders brushed, close enough that it felt right. We didn't speak immediately. Words felt redundant after everything we'd just crossed, the tension, the longing, the months of silent ache. Instead, our hands found each other, fingers intertwining naturally, the simple warmth of her skin grounding me, steadying the wild pulse of desire and relief. She leaned slightly against me, just enough that I could feel the weight of her trust, the subtle quiver in her shoulder that told me she was still cautious, still human, still Caroline. I rested my forehead against hers, inhaling the faint scent of her hair, and let the quiet stretch between us, safe and intimate. "I was so worried," she murmured, voice soft, almost shy, a vulnerability that made her seem both impossibly strong and heartbreakingly fragile. "About everything. About being honest. About us." "I know," I whispered back. "I was too. But we're here now." My thumb brushed over hers gently, a silent promise. "And we'll figure it out together." Her lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile, and I felt the tension in her shoulders ease. She tilted her head slightly, nudging me with a softness that spoke more than any words could. For the first time in years, I felt fully seen, fully understood. The age difference, the years of restraint, the fear of judgment, they all felt less significant now. Sitting this close, sharing this warmth, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that we were here, choosing each other despite the obstacles, despite the risks. Caroline let out a quiet laugh, soft and genuine, and I felt a jolt of happiness that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with connection. We leaned back together in the chair, heads touching lightly, breathing the same air, hearts sinking in a rhythm that was entirely ours. I brushed my hand across her cheek, and she leaned into the touch, closing her eyes briefly. "I miss this," she admitted, voice low, intimate, as though even saying it aloud was a surrender. "I miss you too," I said simply, letting the words settle, letting them carry the weight of every unspoken thought, every lingering glance, every subtle ache we'd shared over the years. And then, as the sun dipped lower, we sat quietly, fingers intertwined, foreheads touching, not needing to speak. The world beyond the classroom could wait. For the first time, we didn't have to hide. For the first time, it felt right, fully right, to be together. I held her hand a little tighter, and she gave a faint squeeze in return. Warmth, trust, desire, understanding, they all fit together perfectly in that small space. We stayed like that for a long while, the silence full of promise, of certainty, of love quietly but unmistakably claimed. Did you enjoy the story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next?